Today, we have a speaker, Rob Weinberg. Actually, he and I are going to have a dialogue about the book primarily. And I should introduce him real quick. He has a bachelor's degree at honors level in visual art and music from the University of Brighton in the UK, master's in art history from the University of Buckingham. He's also worked for 3 decades in radio as a journalist and producer. He's published 9 different books, including several important biographies of early British Bahá'ís, Lady Blomfield and Ethel Rosenberg in particular. He served from 2009 to 2013 as the director of the Baha'i International Community's Office of Public Information in Haifa, Israel, where I believe I first met him when I was on pilgrimage in 2010, in fact. And he's currently chair of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United Kingdom, having returned to the UK from Israel after his work there. So, Rob, welcome to the Wilmette Institute's webinar, and we're looking forward to having this conversation with you today and hearing about your book further. Why don't you start by telling us what and sort of what process you went through in putting it together?
Well, during the preparations for the bicentenary of the birth of the Bab, I was putting together a book called The Primal Point, which came out in time for that bicentenary. And what I was interested in doing was really looking at the extraordinary reach of the story of the Bab and how it was very well known and very well appreciated in very far afield across the West, in Europe, in the British Isles, Russia, India, all sorts of places. And I was interested in sort of collecting the different accounts of the Bab, not so much the press accounts, but some of the literary and other tributes, testimonials that appeared in the Western literature. And the book came out in time for that bicentenary. And then when the House of Justice began to talk about this centenary of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá coming up, I thought it would be nice to try and do something similar. So I wasn't particularly so interested in there are so many thousands of pilgrim accounts and stories of Abdu'l-Bahá in the West and how, people met him and the things he said to them and the things he said in the various talks. So I wasn't so interested in looking at those because they're very well covered in other literature. But I was interested in thinking about how was Abdu'l-Bahá perceived by the people who met him, and not so much what he said, but the kind of effect that he had on them and how they described him. And then as I was putting it together, I began to think, well, we should see what Baha'u'llah had to say about Abdu'l-Bahá, and we should see what Shoghi Effendi said about Abdu'l-Bahá in the House of Justice, and also the Greatest Holy Leaf, his sister. And then how did Abdu'l-Bahá talk about himself? So the book sort of began to take shape, first of all, in terms of series of tributes to Abdu'l-Bahá. And then I found that we could more or less trace his whole life chronologically, because, of course, there's so much material about his travels to the West, so many accounts. But it was a very brief period. It was only 3 years of a 77-year life. So I was interested to try and find how Abdu'l-Bahā's time initially in Iran and then in Baghdad and then in the banishments to Constantinople and Adrianople and Akka, how were those reported? Who were the people that met him in those places? And also in the other places he visited, like Egypt, for example, which isn't so well documented as the journey through America. So I was able to sort of trace a chronological history of the life of Abdu'l-Bahá through the eyes of the people that saw him. And I came up with this phrase, looking through one of the very early books about the faith was by the Oxford theologian T.K. Shane, who wrote a book called The Reconciliation of Races and Religions. And he calls one chapter Ambassador to Humanity, about Abdu'l-Bahá. And I've always liked that title. I thought one day I want to write a book called Ambassador to Humanity about Abdu'l-Bahá. Didn't quite know what the book would be, though, at the time. But it's interesting, actually, when you think about the word ambassador, the origins of the word, it comes from Latin word ambactus, which means servant. So it's a very appropriate word to use in relation to Abdu'l-Bahá, whose name obviously means servant, servant of Bahá. And this idea that he was not only an ambassador on behalf of Baha'u'llah in all the interactions that he had with the outside world throughout their exiles and their banishments, but also coming to the West as an ambassador of the Baha'i faith. And then I was sort of contemplating this idea of, well, an embassy is a place where, if you're in another country, your embassy is the place where you go if you need assistance. Mm-hmm. And it felt like Abdu'l-Bahá was somehow also an ambassador for the kingdom of God to humanity, that he was the person that people could turn to and find refuge or support or assistance. So it just seemed like a very nice phrase that kind of captured his whole life, really.
Yeah. I was intrigued by the "to" part of it. The ambassador part I can understand, but if I was thinking it was an ambassador for humanity or something like that. But I'm glad that you've explained the "to," because that one had me kind of puzzled. And certainly ambassador for Baha'u'llah or for God to humanity makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
And it does fit his station, doesn't it? As the exemplar and such.
Yes, I mean, Abdu'l-Bahá has so many names. You know, he was known as Abbas Effendi in his early years. Baha'u'llah himself gave him this title of the Master, and he became known as the Master to the Baha'i communities in the early days. He was knighted by the British government, so he became Sir Abdu'l-Bahá Abbas Effendi. But I think one of the interesting titles of Abdu'l-Bahá is the Mystery of God. And that's a title that Baha'u'llah used for him. And he really is a mystery, because at the same time, we have a human being, not a manifestation of God, but he was born on the exact same day as the birth of the revelation of the Bab. So a whole new chapter, a whole new era, a cycle in human history begins with the declaration of the Bab. And on that very same day, a single human being was born who was to become the recipient of that revelation and the living exemplar of the teachings and the values and the vision, if you like, of that revelation. So we have a human being who's walking in the world, ostensibly as a human being, and yet, as Shoghi Effendi describes in the Dispensation of Baha'u'llah, he's not a manifestation of God, but his station is so high in comparison to us as ordinary human beings. And yet, in his role as this exemplar and this embodiment of all the Baha'i teachings, all the Baha'i values, humanity has someone to turn to. For the early Baha'is, obviously his position as the center of the covenant appointed by Baha'u'llah, he's a person who can clarify and interpret and explain the revelation in terms that people can understand. But for all time, here is a human being who is an exemplar, who is someone we can look at and ask ourselves the question in almost any situation, well, what would Abdu'l-Bahá do? How would Abdu'l-Bahá have handled this? And I don't think humanity's ever had a personage like that before, that we can turn to and seek a kind of guidance, inspiration and example from.
Yeah, Christians certainly would say that Jesus does that for them. The difficulty is that the Gospels are fairly spotty in terms of many issues in the modern world. And so it would be difficult to know what Jesus would do under certain circumstances. Whereas with Abdu'l-Bahá, we actually know, for example, that he endorsed votes for women, and he endorses racial unity and interracial marriage, and talks about economic adjustments, and is very specific in many cases. So indeed, he is in that sense really quite an example for us. He answers a lot of these questions, ethical questions.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the Baha'i community today and the areas of activity that the Universal House of Justice has set in motion and is asking us to focus on, the House of Justice says we're involved in sort of three broad areas of activity: expansion and consolidation, participation in the discourses of society, and social action. And actually, Abdu'l-Bahá, again, exemplifies and embodies all of these areas of action, activity, in terms of his expansion consolidation work. You have him obviously teaching the faith, proclaiming the principles of the faith, and consolidating that. And, there's such a wealth of activity that he was involved in terms of building community in Iran and other parts of the world, sending American women doctors and educators to Iran, encouraging Baha'is in Iran to establish public baths and different areas of life, schools, hospitals, and so on. So there's a sort of consolidation aspect to that, but there's a social action aspect to that. But on his own doorstep, I think one of the things that's so fascinating really is that for 42 years of his life, he was a prisoner in Akka. And 42 years is a long time. And it wasn't a time when he was giving public talks he was writing a lot of letters to Baha'is all over the world. And it was the time when the first Western pilgrims came and the faith began to spread to the West, and he was able to guide them. But for most of his life in Akka, it seems to me, he was engaged in serving his neighborhood, which is also one of the key things that we're being called upon to really focus on in the plans of the House of Justice now. He was visiting the sick, he was visiting the poor, he was making sure people didn't go hungry or cold, and became loved and admired so greatly that when you look at the funeral of Abdu'l-Bahá, 10,000 people turn up. And the population of Haifa at that time was only about 20,000 people. So you think of the extraordinary percentage, 50% of the population who lined the streets and carried the coffin and turned up to pay tribute to him. So he wasn't, and he wouldn't have been known as the head of the Baha'i faith in the sense that he wasn't teaching the Baha'i faith in the Holy Land. You can't teach the Baha'i faith in the Holy Land. So he was living that life, and he was exemplifying all the Baha'i teachings and virtues. And through that, he was effecting social change. And in the last years of his life, the British governor generals and military mandate in the Holy Land were turning to him for guidance and advice. And he was able then to apply his wisdom and his knowledge to the discourses of the day. And you mentioned the equality of men and women, the right of women to vote, racial equality, all of those, the extremes of poverty and wealth, all of those issues that were issues in the West when he was traveling. And he could engage with those discourses, but he could also, at a very practical level, engage with the discourses of, town planning in Haifa. He sat on a board about sort of the arrangement of the streets and provision of schools and all sorts of things in the Holy Land.
They actually invited him to serve on a committee?
Yes, he was part of that. And it was Sir Patrick Geddes, who he'd met in Scotland, who was taken to the Holy Land and mapped out the town plan for Tel Aviv and also for Haifa as well. So, there was all manner of discourses that he was engaged in at the local level as well.
Interesting. How intriguing.
Yeah. And one of the stories I came across was, I think it was a nun who says to Lady Blomfield at one point, I can't begin to tell you the things that Abdu'l-Bahá has done for us, supporting us financially and in terms of, and of course we know in Haifa there is Abbas Street. It's actually named after him, and that school, which sits on Abbas Street, a lot of that was funded by Abdu'l-Bahá, as far as I know.
Interesting. I've even heard a friend of mine, an American friend of mine, who talked to a very elderly Jewish person in the United States whose parents lived in Haifa, who were recipients of Abdu'l-Bahā's assistance. So even as late as the 80s, you could still encounter people who had been involved in all of this largesse on the part of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Yes, I
Why
mean,
don't go
sorry,
ahead.
some years ago, we met a woman in Sussex in the south of England while we were doing some teaching, and she said, "Well, I knew Abbas Effendi. I grew up in Haifa," and she said, I mean, she'd never become a Baha'i, but she said, "I always feel like my life has been blessed because I met, and knew Abdu'l-Bahá when I was a little girl, and he always used to stop and talk to us and give us sweets." And she said the pictures don't do anything, they don't capture him at all, the pictures that we have.
The energy.
Yeah.
The energy is the thing that strikes me. I was quite impressed to read somewhere that when Abdu'l-Bahá spoke, he paced back and forth, and he often had prayer beads in his hand, and so he's doing this with his prayer beads while he's talking.
Mm.
And so I'd sort of heard that and it didn't strike me anything. But then I saw one of the moving pictures of Abdu'l-Bahá that was taken in the backyard of Howard McNutt's house, and his mouth is moving, and he's walking back and forth, and he's doing this with his prayer beads. He's giving a talk. Here we are seeing him give a talk. We can't hear it. There was no talking pictures in those days, but this is actually Abdu'l-Bahá giving a presentation, a talk to people. And
there's so many stories of him dictating letters in a similar manner, pacing up and down, and he'd have different secretaries, one writing in Persian, one writing in Arabic, one writing in Turkish, and he would walk up and down the line, and he would be dictating letters simultaneously, often writing his own a letter in his own handwriting, just with a piece of paper in his hand and the pen, and just this ability to multitask. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, it's really, really quite amazing. Really quite amazing. Tell us a little bit about his childhood. There are sources about his childhood, and his extraordinary abilities are quite obvious, really, very early, it seems to me.
Yes, well, what we know about his childhood, of course, we know that the family was very privileged, and life was fairly, very comfortable for them until he was about 8-9 years old, when, of course, Baha'u'llah was arrested and thrown into the Siachal, and they become very vulnerable to attacks. And I think most of the accounts, really, of the childhood that I came across come from the pen of the greatest Holy Leaf herself. And I mean, his qualities were evident at an early age. We know the story where Abdu'l-Bahá is sent by Baha'u'llah to meet some shepherds on the land that they owned. And it was commonly expected that the owner of the land would give gifts to the shepherds. And Abdu'l-Bahá, as a boy, gave them the entire flock of sheep. And Baha'u'llah himself has said that we have to keep an eye on him because he'll give himself away one day. So, there are stories like that, but he clearly recognized Baha'u'llah's station at a very young age, and shared in the tribulations and the woes of the family. And he was extremely heartbroken at seeing the effect that imprisonment in the Siachal had on Baha'u'llah. And at that point, of course, all the luxury the family had was at an end. They were deserted by relations and friends. They were banished. But even in these early banishments, you begin to see him taking this role in the community of protecting Baha'u'llah and serving the family, serving Baha'u'llah, and making arrangements so that things would be smoothed out. And he would ride at Baha'u'llah's side when they were being banished from place to place. He would ride at Baha'u'llah's side from time to time. And at night time, he and others would ride ahead to whatever village they were coming to make sure that accommodation was there and food was there and so on. But there's a story also of him being so tired that the only time when he could grab any rest would be to ride ahead of the group, lay down, catch 40 winks, as we say, and until the rest of the caravan caught up, so that he could then carry on with the journey.
Yeah.
But then, of course, Baha'u'llah goes off into the mountains of Suleymaniye, and Abdu'l-Bahá was bereft, really. And Bahir Khanum actually says, my brother was deeply attached to his father, that this attachment seemed to strengthen with his growth. After our father's departure, he fell into great despondency. He would go away by himself, and when sought for, be found weeping, often falling into such paroxysms of grief that no one could console him. His chief occupation at this time was copying and committing to memory the tablets of the Bab. The childhood and youth of my brother was, in fact, in all respects unusual. He did not care for play or for amusement like other children. He would not go to school, nor would he apply himself to study. Horseback riding was the only diversion of which he was fond. In that he became proficient, being reputed to be a very skillful horseman. And Mirza Musa...
He's 10 at that point. You're talking about 1854 when Baha'u'llah goes up into Suleymaniye.
And Baha'u'llah's brother, Mirza Musa, would take Abdu'l-Bahá to the mosque and also some of the meetings of the friends. And Munire Khanum, Abdu'l-Bahā's wife, says during this time he was taken by his uncle, Mirza Musa, to some of the meetings of the friends. There he spoke to them with a marvelous eloquence, even at that early age of 11 or 12 years. The friends wondered at his wisdom and the beauty of his person, which equaled that of his mind. And he prayed without ceasing for the return of Baha'u'llah. He would sometimes spend a whole night through praying certain prayer. And of course, Baha'u'llah comes back. And in those following years leading up to the declaration in the Rezvan garden, he again increased his role, if you like, of serving Baha'u'llah, serving the family, and being kind of this front man, if you like, for the Baha'i community with the authorities. And that became even more so in Adrianople and Constantinople, that he was the one that was negotiating on behalf of the prisoners. He was the one that was dealing with the governor, you know, the jailers in Akka and so on.
He's in his early 20s by then, unfortunately.
Yeah. He wanted to leave Baha'u'llah free to be able to focus on, you know, revealing the divine verses, and he was the one that took charge of all the affairs of the family and won over the hardest-hearted of all the governors and officials and jailers. You know, this strength of this character, that he became someone that they would confide in and love. One of the accounts I found interestingly was, by this time, the jailers in Akka had become so fond of him and they respected him so greatly. He wanted to leave the jail to be able to go to the baths. And they say, well, we have to chain you. We're really sorry, but we have to chain you. You're a prisoner. And they would chain his hands. And then they said, it's, you know, kind of humiliating for you. So if we arrange your robe in this way, we can cover over the chains. So that people won't see that your hands are chained. And Abdu'l-Bahá refused to let them do that. He said, no, this is my glory. This is my honor to be walk in the street and show that I'm a prisoner in the path of God, you know. So, yeah.
I was impressed that you had found accounts from two, I guess, Christian missionaries in Akka about Abdu'l-Bahá. And they were really very, very complimentary, considering how probably they had not met Abdu'l-Bahá extensively, first of all, and second of all, they had their own axe to grind, as it were, at that time.
Yes. Well, two of them, they were from the London Jews Society, which was a missionary organization that went to the Holy Land, Thomas Chaplin and James Neal. And Thomas Chaplin says, we were received by Baha'u'llah's son, who is apparently about 30 years of age, and has a fine intellectual countenance with black hair and beard, and that sallow, melancholic look which distinguished nearly all Persians of the intelligent and religious class.
Not sure what that means.
But he says he had a remarkably earnest, almost solemn manners, spoke excellent Arabic fluently, and showed a minute and accurate knowledge of the Old and New Testaments, as well as an acquaintance with the history of religions throughout Europe, religious thought in Europe. And then James Neal says, we had a long interview with the son of the prophet. It was indeed strange to find an Eastern in Syria so well educated, and to hear him speak so tolerantly and intelligibly of Christ and Christianity. So that, yes, they were impressed by him. It's a bit patronizing to think that there weren't people in Syria who didn't understand Christianity, where, of course, many of them are Christians.
Yeah. Well, but certainly the Muslim population had no particular interest in these topics either. And then the fact that Abdu'l-Bahá comes out of the Muslim population probably is part of the reason they're impressed too.
Yes. And then, of course, Professor Brown himself, who goes to meet Baha'u'llah in 1890, he meets Abdu'l-Bahá and leads. I mean, we're very familiar with Professor Brown's account of meeting Baha'u'llah, but his account of meeting Abdu'l-Bahá is really wonderful and
equally important, really.
Yes. He says, "Seldom have I seen one whose appearance impressed me more. A tall, strongly built man, holding himself straight as an arrow, with white turban and raiment, long black locks reaching almost to the shoulder, broad, powerful forehead indicating a strong intellect, combined with an unswerving will, eyes keen as a hawk, and strongly marked but pleasing features." And then he goes on to say, "Subsequent conversation with him served only to heighten the respect with which his appearance had from the first inspired me, one more eloquent of speech, more ready of argument, more apt of illustration, more intimately acquainted with the sacred books of the Jews, the Christians, and the Mohammedans, could, I should think, scarcely be found, even amongst the eloquent, ready, and subtle race to which he belongs." So Professor Brown was very impressed by him.
Yeah.
I think these descriptions are interesting as well, because, of course, the pictures we see of Abdu'l-Bahá are always of a man in his 60s, released from prison with white hair and white beard, and these accounts talk about him being, very erect, very upright, long black hair, black beard,
and handsome,
and because we don't
handsome young man.
Yeah,
that's very true. That's very true.
Yes.
Egypt I'm particularly intrigued. Of course, I'm skipping ahead a bit to Abdu'l-Bahā's travels to Egypt, and he spent a lot of time in Egypt. We don't know a lot about that, of course, in the English language works that are available. More is becoming available all the time, actually, which is quite impressive. But he saw Westerners as well as large numbers of Egyptian and other Middle Eastern intellectuals and persons of importance there, and for that matter, the newspapers also wrote about him too, I believe. So,
yes,
what can you tell us of that?
Well, of course, Abdu'l-Bahá leaves Haifa in August 1910, and it seems that the purpose of going to Egypt was just to rest and gather his strength for the next stage of the journey. But he actually ends up spending a whole year in Egypt before he even goes to France. And, at one level, we could say, well, his health was so kind of broken by all those years of imprisonment that he needed that year to build his strength and recuperate and so forth. But actually, he uses every minute of that time. And there was a lot of misconceptions about the faith in Egypt at that time. I think there were newspapers that were Persian funded. There was, misunderstanding, misinformation. And Abdu'l-Bahá, again, I mean, it's really the first time that he's appeared outside of the Holy Land. And his impact, the impact he had on the people he met was quite striking. So, for example, in the book, we have some examples from different newspapers. Mohammed newspaper writes this about Abdu'l-Bahá: "Whosoever associates with him find him a man who has information upon all subjects of human interest. His words are eloquent and attract the hearts and enkindle the souls. His teachings and conversation revolve around the center of the greatest of the world's problems, to remove entirely religious, racial and patriotic prejudices, and lay the foundation of a brotherhood and unity that will last throughout the ages and eternity." And then another newspaper, El Ahram, says, "No one has visited him without leaving impressed by his presence and praising his qualities and wondering at his magnanimity and his astonishing mind." So he really turned it around in Egypt. He turned around the impact, the reputation of the faith and an understanding of what he represented and what Baha'u'llah represented. But you're right. Also, there were Westerners who met him there. Lewis Gregory met him in Egypt and left a wonderful description of that. Tudor Pole, the British man who was so influential in Abdu'l-Bahá's travels in Britain and bringing the faith to public attention in Britain, he met him in Egypt for the first time. I think it was in Egypt that also Abdu'l-Bahá recommended, began this plotting the marriage of Lewis Gregory and Louisa Matthew.
Well, it seems likely since they were both on pilgrimage at the same time in Egypt. Yes. Yeah. He must have seen something there and said, oh, we'll see what we can do about this.
And I think that's very important. You mentioned it earlier on in the introduction that one of the key discourses in the United States, even to this day, is racial equality and racial prejudice, and just how radical it was that Abdu'l-Bahá would encourage, a Black African American to marry a white English woman, because not only as an example of promoting the oneness of humanity, but also as a kind of lesson to the Baha'i community.
Yes. Because
for the next 40 years, every time they were seen together at any event, this was a reminder to the community what Abdu'l-Bahá had in mind. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And that inevitably had a long-term impact on the thinking of thousands of Baha'is and their friends. And of course was a continued proof to the African Americans of the Baha'i faith's commitment as well. Then he goes to Europe for the first time. He'd ever been in Europe. He gives his first public talk ever, I guess, unless he gave some in Egypt, which I haven't heard. And he meets many, many intellectuals, thinkers, mystics, all sorts of people in Europe. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that particular trip and some of the highlights that you came across?
Well, I think Abdu'l-Bahá goes to the places where he had followers. If you think about London was, a major Baha'i center, although the numbers were small. I mean, there were Baha'is in London. Right. There were, of course, Baha'is in Paris, because that was the first European Baha'i community. There were Baha'is in Stuttgart in Germany and Vienna. And he also goes to Budapest, where there were, perhaps wasn't a Baha'i community as such, but there were theosophists who'd invited him and so on. And then, of course, in the United States, by that time, and it's only a matter of 20 years since the faith was first mentioned in the United States, there are communities all through the United States. But I think the people he meets was a reflection of the kind of social circles of the Baha'is. So, of course, in London, Lady Blomfield hosted him, and she was very well connected with lords and ladies and members of parliament and various other sort of prominent figures in the arts and so forth. So you see in London in particular, he's meeting prominent people. Ezra Pound, the poet, is brought to meet Abdu'l-Bahá through his connection with Laura Barney and Natalie Barney, her sister. And even he's impressed. I mean, he's extremely cynical. And afterwards he says, he says, I met the Baha'i yesterday, a dear man, a dear old man. But then he says, and then he writes to a friend in Paris and says, it's more important than Cézanne, his friend in Paris. And not in the least like what would you expect of an Oriental religious now. At least I went to conduct an inquisition and came away feeling that questions would have been an impertinence. So you've got to figure like Ezra.
God bless him. God bless him. I studied his poetry in a course, so it's always happy to hear about this.
And he actually includes Abdu'l-Bahá in one of his poems later on. It's a strange kind of modernist poem, but he mentions him, so it clearly didn't leave him, that experience. And then you have educationists like Professor Michael Sadler, who was a sort of leading educationalist in Leeds. He chairs a meeting with Abdu'l-Bahá in London. And of course, Abdu'l-Bahá, at that time, Lady Blomfield was connected with suffragettes. He meets Charlotte Despard. He certainly meets one of the Pankhursts. He gives talks to women's organizations in the West. And then in Paris, a similar sort of pattern with philosophers and leading, but also leading churchmen. I mean, London is really interesting because the St. John's Westminster was sort of one of the most important churches in Britain, and Archdeacon Wilberforce, who was in charge, was one of the very charismatic, very important church leader at that time. And he invites Abdu'l-Bahá to come and speak at St. John's. Reverend R.J. Campbell was a kind of more radical Christian minister, but the City Temple was a hugely popular place. I mean, 2,000 or 3,000 people would go to the services. And he again brings Abdu'l-Bahá to come and speak at the church. And these were personal friends of Tudor Pole and Lady Blomfield. So those circles were very connected, you know, the circles the Baha'is moved in. Yes, we had, and press coverage. And it's actually interesting because there's this, in those days, Abdu'l-Bahá didn't want people to take photographs of him. When the first pilgrims went to the Holy Land, they brought cameras with them and asked Abdu'l-Bahá if they could take pictures. The only picture they had of Abdu'l-Bahá was the one from Adrianople as a young man. And he just didn't want his photo taken. And if people join the course, the Wilmette Institute course that we're doing, there's a document I've put together of some of the portraits of Abdu'l-Bahá, but there's a photograph of Abdu'l-Bahá's hand, because he said, he said to the pilgrims, oh, well, if you really want a photograph of me, you can take a picture of my hand. And so he it's just this hand sticking out into the photograph.
It's most unfortunate because it's caused generations of palm readers to speculate about Abdu'l-Bahá.
They called the picture "The Hand That Holds the World," and they circulated it as the only picture they had of Abdu'l-Bahá. Anyway, when he comes to London, the press are camped out like paparazzi. They're snapping photos of him in doorways and coming in and out of buildings and so on. And Lady Blomfield says to him, please, Abdu'l-Bahá, can we go to a proper studio, a proper photographic studio, and have some portraits done? Because these ones that appear in the papers are terrible. And he agrees. So he has his first formal photographs taken in Studio Lafayette in London. And then from then on, his photographs taken everywhere, in Paris by Taponnier, the photographer there, and then in the United States as well. He goes and visits some leading photographers who take. And
one of the first color photos ever taken in the world, in fact, is one of Abdu'l-Bahá in Paris, and that's right. 1911, I guess.
Yeah, Verkamp. Yes, that was actually it was a photographic process. He was experimenting with color. Wasn't a colored black and white print.
Right. Wasn't colorized.
Yeah. So he was very well known and very well received. And there's two wonderful books that Amin Echez put together, Apostle of Peace, of all of the press coverage, or large amounts of the press coverage of his travels. And when I was putting this book together, I was thinking, well, I don't want to duplicate stuff, but then I still felt like some of it should go in, because it's very interesting to see how the press received him and were touched by him. And one of the famous accounts is by Kate Carew. Oh, yes. I love Kate Carew. And Kate Carew was a very kind of acerbic kind of newspaper columnist who drew cartoons as well of her victims. Even caricatures, you might say. They're often a bit caricaturish. And she writes this wonderful account, which is in the book, about she describes the followers. She sits in the waiting room at the Ansonia Hotel. She describes the different kinds of people that are sitting in the waiting room, rather sort of cynically, but she's completely melted by Abdu'l-Bahá. Yeah, absolutely. And Thornton Chase apparently had read this Kate Carew article and said, if Kate Carew can be affected by Abdu'l-Bahá, even a Kate Carew, he says. And of course, the American Baha'is were really afraid that the press would caricature this Oriental-looking man with his flowing robes.
and this, of course, did not happen at all. They were really I think, quite surprised by that.
Yes. And I mean, you've done some research yourself about some of the other kind of Eastern teachers that came to the West and identified some of the differences, I think, that between Abdu'l-Bahá and previous teachers.
Yep. Yeah, and it's really quite interesting because, as you said, everywhere Abdu'l-Bahá went, there was already a Baha'i community. Even if it was 2 or 3 people, it was still a community of some sort. And the result is that the information we have on Abdu'l-Bahā's trip is vastly richer than the information we have on Dharmapala or Vivekananda. They had no followers, and the lady who reconstructs Vivekananda's travels in America must have spent thousands of articles going through newspaper microfilms. And there's whole, weeks where she doesn't know where he was. Nowadays, I'm sure with the web, those gaps could be filled in much better. But, it's so much easier to know what someone's doing if there are people there who are his followers writing it down and sending letters and, writing it in their diaries and such. And then you can find the stuff in your own archives. Or the grandkids who are still Baha'is, have it. It's really quite an interesting contrast that way.
And also just in terms of the things he was talking about, I mean, most of the other, as far as I understand it, most of the other Eastern teachers came to raise funds.
Frequently they did, yes.
Frequently to support their ashrams and missions back home.
They needed money.
Yeah.
Whereas
this extraordinary thing about Abdu'l-Bahá, I mean, he wouldn't accept money from anyone.
Right.
In fact, he was giving it out.
Yep.
He was going to the Bahá'í and dispensing money.
Kate Carew even comments about that. She even comments about how, unlike the other teachers, he's giving the money away. Yeah, God bless Hukukullah. Presumably where he was getting his support. My joke, of course, is he used MasterCard, but this is not true. Not true. But yes, and Kate Carew, there's one particular scene where they're getting in the car to go to the Bowery. And in those days, they would just pile 10 people into a car, and they'd be practically sitting on top of each other and scrunched down on the floor. Nowadays, we would be horrified with that kind of arrangement. But it was very common, actually, and it happened several times on Abdu'l-Bahā's trip. And Kate Carew was kind of given a little tiny corner in the car, and she's immediately thinking, I could really write something very funny about this. And as soon as she's thinking that, Abdu'l-Bahá turns to her and says, you press people must take us very seriously. And she says, this is what Abdu'l-Bahá said to her as soon as she thought that. So it's really quite interesting, this relationship she had with him. This just an hour or two, she meets him, does the interview, and then he says, come to the Bowery with me. And so she must have been his last interviewer. And she goes to the Bowery with him. Really quite interesting.
He and one of the things I've been discovering really is that Abdu'l-Bahá very rarely teaches the Baha'i. I mean, he's teaching Baha'i principles, but he's very rarely seeking converts. Right. Overtly seeking converts, if you like. Right. He, in all of his interactions with people, and they all comment on this in a way, he seems to see into them. He seems to see what their capacity is and tries to encourage them to become the best that they can be.
Yes.
And sometimes he's encouraging Christians to become better Christians, or Jews to become better Jews, or whatever it may be. And someone like Kate Carew, he clearly sees in her, the potential to write a really positive story that's going to appear on the front page of the New York papers,
syndicated, various places. Yeah.
So he has this capacity to give to every soul he meets whatever it is that they need in order to evolve further. But when he's with the Baha'is, he's emphasizing the covenant, and that's very significant because, of course, he announces himself. Although they knew he was the center of the covenant from Baha'u'llah's will and testament, in New York, he takes that opportunity to really hammer home this center of the covenant, being the center of the covenant. And And actually, in some of the, I was looking through the accounts when he writes about himself. He either writes about his suffering, none of which he ever complains about. It's always in glorious terms. But he writes a lot about, and in his speech talks in the West, he talks a lot about his station as the center of the covenant. And again, he kind of detaches it from himself. He says, "This isn't about me. This is about what Baha'u'llah's established, and I am the I'm the one who's been chosen to be this representative,
the ambassador."
Yeah, and I like very much. He uses in one of his statements this analogy of a governor general, and he says it's as if a king appoints a governor general, and he says if you obey or disobey the governor general, you're obeying or disobeying the king.
Right.
It doesn't matter. It's someone else. They're the representative of the king. And he likens himself to that and says, again, this isn't about me. This is about the station. And I think this, if we're called upon, as we have been this year by the House of Justice, to profoundly reflect upon Abdu'l-Bahá, they say about his life and mission and the strength of the covenant of which he is the center. And I've only actually just clocked this word strength. Yeah. Because we say, okay, this is the center of the covenant, but actually this ability of the covenant to preserve the unity of the Baha'i faith intact for over 100 years, now coming up, that, with this clear delineation of Abdu'l-Bahá and in turn Shoghi Effendi and the establishment of the House of Justice, which was ordained by Baha'u'llah, that this principle of having a center to which you turn, and given this authority, whoso obeyeth him hath obeyed God, whoso disobeyeth him hath disobeyed God, and so forth with the House of Justice. This is really unique. And of course, the mission of Baha'u'llah is to establish unity in the world. So you have to have a covenant. You can't have a Baha'i community that's disunited. Yeah. And that strength of the covenant that only seems to grow stronger. It's interesting, isn't it? Like with other religions, it seems that over time they split more and more and more branches and more churches. And it seems that in the history of the faith, those fierce attacks on the covenant come early on, and have become fewer and fewer as time's gone on. It's not to say we don't know what the future holds, but it seems that it was really at those periods of transition between Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi in the House of Justice, that the covenant was most vulnerable, and yet it's remained strong, and it becomes stronger.
It's hard to imagine how there would be a successful challenge now to the covenant. I'm sure people will at some point try, but the covenant now has a momentum, has a depth of establishment that, and culturally in the Baha'i community, the culture of the community understands it so much better. So I think you're quite right.
Shoghi Effendi says that about the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. He says it will take a full century for us to really understand its power and its workings, And of course,
we're coming up on that point.
And we can see, also with the emphasis the House of Justice is putting on us devoting ourselves to studying Book 8, Ruhi Book 8 about the Covenant, and Book 9, and also, all of the really reflecting on the spiritual health of the community, and what is required of us as individuals. Again, reflection on the life of Abdu'l-Bahá provides us with a lot of that strength, I think.
I'm always impressed by Abdu'l-Bahā's interactions with Howard Colby Ives, because you don't ever get the impression Abdu'l-Bahá was calling on him to become a Baha'i, but that was the result, of course. And to some extent, you have to assume that Abdu'l-Bahá did have that in mind in his own indirect way. And I think the way I've often thought about Abdu'l-Bahā's modus operandi is that he exerts a centripetal force. He pulls people to the center, which is Baha'u'llah. And that means if there are people out there who know nothing, he brings them a little closer. The people who've come a little closer, he brings them a little closer still, perhaps to the point where they can accept Baha'u'llah. For them, they have to come even closer and eventually become consecrated. But if you can only go this far, Barik Allah, fantastic. Keep trying, bit by bit, keep coming. But every little bit is praised. Every little movement towards the spiritual center is praised. And I think that's, to me, a great lesson for how we interact with people. We can't expect everybody just to, we're going to become Baha'is. Well, if they become impressed by some aspect of the faith, that's great. That's great. Maybe we would like more, but we have no control over that. It's up to each person, and we encourage them, we love them, we help them in any way that we can to exert that centripetal force towards the center.
Mm. Yeah, one of the things that's come, I've been thinking, having gone through all of these texts and tried to pull some together, Abdu'l-Bahá seems to be entirely unself-conscious. Like it's so often when we're teaching, we either have a motive, it's like we really, really want that person to respond, and then maybe make a judgment afterward. Oh, well, they're not really interested, they're not receptive, or whatever, or we're concerned about how we're going to be seen, or I don't want to push it too much. I don't know, are they going to think I'm a religious nut or whatever it may be, and Abdu'l-Bahá's just out there giving all the time, he's just, and regardless, I mean, there are some people that he says, leave them to themselves,
Yeah.
But, nevertheless, in his interaction with them, it's always loving, it's always encouraging, and it's always, like you've recently been talking about his role as an accompanier of people, the way he would pick people and give them things to do that they thought were entirely beyond their capacity.
Yeah.
Right. So he takes Agnes Parsons, who's a wealthy Washington, D.C. society person, and asks her to organize the Race Unity Conference.
She won't have anything to do with black people, thank you, but she learns.
Yeah. And Corinne True, putting Corinne True in charge of raising the temple. Yep. Or sending someone to Egypt, or sending them to petition the Shah of Iran about literature, or whatever it may be. He sees the capacity of people to do things, and he gives them jobs to do, and then accompanies them all the way, encourages them, sends them letters,
and accompanies them by having them accompany him on his voyages, his travels. I've been very impressed by seeing how he would continuously have some young Baha'i come stay with him for a few days. And then when that person left, someone else would show up. And these people later become members of national spiritual assemblies. They become members of the National Teaching Committee. They go pioneering. They devote their lives to the faith. And these precious few days with Abdu'l-Bahá clearly were very, very transformative for them. He was really very active in helping to encourage and to change people. It's really quite amazing. And just reading this, I'm sure, writing about it, Rob, I'm sure you've experienced some of this yourself. It's changed you in some ways, I suspect.
I hope so. I think what was really wonderful about it, I was doing it during the first lockdown, and we'd just come out of the fast, and work was quite thin on the ground. So I thought, if I don't do this now, I probably won't get a chance to do it. So I spent it was a month, or maybe, I mean, I luckily have most of the sources I have close to hand anyway. So I was able to just pull the books off the shelves or go online and find the thing I was looking for, and so on. But I just felt sort of immersed in it, really, for those couple of months. And when you might have found this when you were writing about Thornton Chase, or whenever you're doing that kind of research, you're there, you're with them, they become your community, and if you spend your days just reading these accounts of Abdu'l-Bahá, you're transported there, and I think just that idea that, of course, we've all heard stories about Abdu'l-Bahá, and we know the kinds of things he said and what he wrote about. But, when you think about how people perceived him, who weren't necessarily Baha'is, and the kind of effect that he had on people, like we all know this phrase, let your heart burn with loving kindness for all who may cross your path. And we read that and we say, oh, that's nice, let your heart, and we sing it, make it into a song. But actually, he was doing that. Yeah. His heart was burning with loving kindness for all who crossed his path. Yeah. And I did find myself, I'm trying, like when I go out, I'm just consciously trying to do that. What does it mean, that your heart burns with loving kindness for all who may cross your path? Yeah. So I think that kind of reflection and engagement with him as on his day-to-day life, then you start to think, well, actually, these aren't just nice words or aspirations, but this is something that I have to consciously try and do if I'm going to follow that example.
Exactly. Absolutely true. Yeah, I think one of the advantages of doing the kind of work both of us have done is that you often will see a single event in Abdu'l-Bahā's life from several different angles, from 2 or 3 different people who were there. And it gives an event a 3-dimensional quality that a single account might not give it. And you can indeed almost picture yourself there when you see it from several different angles, and you get the full picture, as full a picture as you can get. So I've experienced that too. We should probably turn to questions, because we have some questions that have been coming in, and we've now been talking almost an hour about Abdu'l-Bahá and about the book. So let me turn to the Q&A first and see what we have. Thelma notes she just finished reading The Master in Egypt, which is full of interesting stories and episodes of Abdu'l-Bahā's long stay there. So that's good. Another person asks how to sign up for the course. The course will be offered again. We don't know whether we'll offer it again. Probably we will. But if you go to wilmetteinstitute.org, that will give you a chance to go find the course. We have something called courses, a link called courses. And if I can, in fact, perhaps when Rob is answering a question or something, I'll try to type it into the chat so that you can find it there and find further information there. Let me see. A lot of people are complaining about bad connections. Someone says, thank you for sharing your magnificent perspective. Can't wait to read the book. So that's certainly encouraging to see as well. I don't actually see any other questions, but I'm sure we will have some in a minute. So we want to. Oh, actually, maybe there's some more now in the Q&A. Some more have popped in. One person asked to say more about Abdu'l-Bahá in Egypt. So maybe you can do that.
Yeah.
While I'm finding the other information for people.
Yes. Well, as I said, Abdu'l-Bahá left the Holy Land in August 1910. It was the first time in 42 years that he'd left the Holy Land. And just that his presence in Egypt for full year, aroused this kind of intense curiosity among prominent Egyptians, the press, the Westerners who visited him. And Horace Holly, for example, talks about, he says, future historians will give Abdu'l-Bahā's journey the detail and the reflection it deserves, but a mere outline in relation to the preceding study reveals even now something of its unique importance. And then he says, ambassador to humanity was the expression used. And this title is perhaps as descriptive as any to hand. But how different the mission, how different the method, how different the man. If any generation could distinguish out while still living the nature most richly and most potently endowed with its best forces, ours has that privilege. In Abdu'l-Bahá, we have a mirror focusing all that is most significant, suppressing all that is irrelevant of our time. So that was just this kind of a preamble to the travels. But like, for example, here's someone called Sheikh Ali Yusuf, who was a Egyptian dignitary. And he says, the eminent Mirza Abbas Effendi, head of the Baha'i faith in Akka and the authority for Baha'is throughout the world, has arrived at the port of Alexandria. He's a sheikh revered throughout the world, an expert in Sharia and learned in the fluctuations and developments of Islamic history. He attracts spirits and souls wholly to his belief in the oneness of mankind, which in its approach corresponds to a belief in the unity of being in religious belief. His teaching and guidance revolve around the elimination of prejudice, whether that is in religion, gender, nationality, or the comforts of temporal life. So this is a prominent Islamic scholar who noted that. And then, as I said, we have people like Lewis Gregory, Tudor Pole, meeting him in Egypt. And they leave beautiful accounts as well. Lewis Gregory says, viewed with the outer eye, he is about the medium height with symmetrical features. His lineaments indicate meekness and gentleness as well as power and strength. His color is about that of parchment. His hands are shapely with the nails well manicured. It's interesting how people observe the physical things. His forehead is high and well-rounded. His nose is slightly aquiline. His eyes light blue and penetrating. His hair is silver, and so forth. And his voice is powerful, but capable of producing infinite pathos and tenderness. His carriage is erect and altogether so majestic and beautiful that it is passing strange that anyone seeing him would not be moved to say, this truly is the King of men.
Blue eyes. I've heard other people say he had brown eyes.
Yeah, I think they were blue.
Interesting. I've posted some of this information about the course, which is also called, and the book, both are called Ambassador to Humanity. The book is published by George Ronald, and the course is available at wilmetteinstitute.org. If you go to the chat, you can see the details for both of those. Go ahead. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, I think there's quite a bit. I mean, Mirza Ahmad Sohrab wrote a book called Abdu'l-Bahá in Egypt, where he gave a sort of day-by-day account of his activities and who he met and so on. And that's recently been printed in a new volume called The Master in Egypt, along with some of the accounts from Star of the West. So I can't off the top of my head, relate every sort of individual that he met and the different conversations he had. But I think the key thing that happened in Egypt was this turnaround in terms of how the press viewed the Baha'i faith. And a lot of these misconceptions were clarified and corrected.
Sheila asks whether it's going to be carried through the U.S. Publishing Trust. And yes, Sheila, it is already available through the Publishing Trust. In fact, it's on sale at the Baha'i House of Worship in Wilmette. Susan asks this interesting question. We hear a lot about Abdu'l-Bahá speaking in churches across Europe and in North America. What was the religious mentality at that time that allowed clergy to invite such a figure as Abdu'l-Bahá to speak so openly to their congregations? Do we know what effect his talks had on these clergy and congregations, other than with Howard Colby eyes?
Yeah, I think, well, in the 19th century, there was this great sort of turmoil in Christianity in the West, because Darwin published The Origin of the Species. So a lot of the sort of time-honored Bible version of history was being challenged by science. And then at the same time, certainly in Britain, you had, because of the empire, you had people becoming very exposed to Hinduism and Islam, and, the religions of the people of the empire. There was the Great Exhibition in London in the 1850s, where people came into contact with much more closely with different cultures. And of course, Queen Victoria herself was extremely fond of her Indian household, the people that she has served her. She, in Osborne House in the Isle of Wight, where she lived, there's a whole corridor of portraits of her beloved Indian household. There's a film that came out a couple of years ago called Victoria and Abdul, which tells the story of this very close relationship she had. And she was certainly very sympathetic to Islam, from what I've seen in her own letters. So the whole kind of religious picture, the landscape was changing. And at the same time, you had things like theosophy, and theosophy is very big in bringing people to the Baha'i faith, because theosophy was this movement which says there is nothing higher than the truth, and it had a similar conception of, although there's some kind of charlatanish kind of behaviors and things that go on, it had this conception of great masters, like, if you like, manifestations of God, but great masters that come from time to time and so forth. So theosophy was big, and I think the sort of more progressive church people recognized that they needed to somehow redefine themselves within that. So Reverend Campbell, for example, who was the pastor at the City Temple, he was promoting something called the New Theology, and he was saying that, and you can see elements of theosophy in what he was teaching. He was saying things like, God is way, way above our understanding, but he deposits his attributes in creation. So we can know God through knowing creation. So, I mean, which is a very Baha'i kind of idea. It's not pantheism in the sense of worshipping nature. God isn't in everything, or God isn't everything, but you can know God by looking at creation. And this kind of new theology was fairly it came under ridicule. Someone said new theology is like a bad photograph, overexposed and underdeveloped. But he was, one that invited Abdu'l-Bahá to speak at the City Temple. Others invited, and Wilberforce was very involved with Tudor Pole, and they were interested in sort of the Holy Grail myths and sort of Celtic revivalism and these sorts of things. So I think the wise church people of the time, or the forward-thinking church people of the time, realized that they had to kind of redefine Christianity, so that it kind of spoke to the modern world and wasn't in conflict with science.
Yeah, in the United States, the churches he spoke to were the Methodists, Congregationalists, the Unitarians, the Universalists. He spoke to theosophical groups. Who did he not speak to? The Catholic Church, Baptist churches, conservative Protestant churches in general. They never would have invited him. The Episcopal Church did, of course. Quite a few Episcopal churches invited him in the United States. And in Canada also, it was the United Church of Canada Church, and I think an Anglican, Anglican, I think is what it's called in Canada, church that invited him to speak. So it was the more liberal-minded, the more open-minded churches that asked him to speak in the first place. And also among the Jews, it was the Reform synagogues that invited him to speak, not conservative or Orthodox ones.
And of course, there was opposition. I mean, those church people came under fire for letting Abdu'l-Bahá speak.
Yep.
And I think it was Wilberforce who let Abdu'l-Bahá sit in the bishop's chair, God forbid, and speak from the pulpit. These were kind of controversial things to do. And certainly when Abdu'l-Bahá was in Scotland, there was a lot of opposition in the press afterwards, a lot of complaint, and the very staunch Scottish Protestant churches were kind of upset about the reception he'd been given. And he warned the Friends when he left Edinburgh. He said, after I leave, there will be a lot of opposition and complaint.
Yeah, that was true also in New York when he spoke to the in Percy Grant's church, which was an Episcopal church, and he was allowed to sit in the bishop's chair or some chair and speak from the pulpit. And this was a violation of church canon law. And there was a lot of complaint about it afterwards in the church, the church newspapers, basically, that were being put out.
Yeah. But Abdu'l-Bahá kind of welcomed opposition as well. That's another element. He said there's a fantastic passage in the compilation on Crisis and Victory where he says, hasten the day that the churchmen will rise up and say to their congregations, the Baha'is are misguided and foolish. He says that's the day when the cause will grow. So he saw that, as it says in the writings, in the final analysis, every force in the universe serves the covenant. So he could see in everything, positive or negative, that ultimately it was advancing the cause.
Yep, and it's interesting though. Vivekananda and Dharmapala dealt with these kinds of things too, but very differently. They really enjoyed being attacked, and they attacked right back. They love to criticize conservative Christians and criticize their whole approach to the world, and enjoyed it very much. But Abdu'l-Bahá did not do that. Abdu'l-Bahá was much more kind to people who opposed him.
He was, there were times where he does do radical things. And there's this lovely story in France where he sends Hippolyte Dreyfus off to the railway station. He says, this lady's coming in on the train. And he says, will you go and meet her? And Dreyfus says, Abdu'l-Bahá, I'm afraid in our culture, it's not the done thing for a man to go and meet a woman off the train, And Abdu'l-Bahá says, well, I didn't come here to reinforce your culture. I came to bring Baha'i culture. So he's often challenging the norms, and I think the comments he makes in the synagogues where he's calling upon the Jews to recognize Christ, that these were really quite radical things. But I suppose everything he does is tempered by his sweetness and his personality, so he can say very radical things, but people don't take offense. Well, it was even in the synagogue in San Francisco where the rabbi had lived in Jerusalem many years and spoke Arabic. And so Abdu'l-Bahá and he were able to converse in Arabic ahead of time. Even there, his Abdu'l-Bahá calling upon the Jews to recognize Christ in some sense caused upset. People walked out. But the rabbi in Washington, D.C. was very upset and had to meet with Abdu'l-Bahá separately the next day about the whole thing. So yes, at that particular time, he wasn't asking them to become Christians. He was asking them to be Jews recognizing the gifts of another manifestation of God. I think that would be probably the way I would put it today. But in our post-Holocaust age, these kinds of things come off in ways they wouldn't have come off in 1912 also. People are much more suspicious and much more sensitive about these kinds of comments than these were the kinds of comments that Jews heard all the time from Christian clergymen in their dialogues with Christian clergymen at the time. And so this was not an unusual type of comment that Abdu'l-Bahá was making, actually. A friend of mine has written an entire book about the American Jesus, where he notes these kinds of dialogues that were going on. So what else? What other comments and questions do we have? Someone already has the book, which is good. We have the exact Amazon.com information about the book now in the chat for anyone who's curious. And we will put we'll have this recording, of course, available and on the Wilmette Institute website, where we have a description of the talk, and we'll have a link to the talk. We'll also be able to put up a link to where people can purchase the book. So people will be able to find that later on as well. What else? Do we have any? Go ahead, Rob. No, I was just going to say, I think this year, because of the pandemic, the publishers have had a hard time, because we haven't had summer schools and national convention, and 2 years we haven't had summer schools and national convention. So, the opportunity to sell the books have been hit by that. I just wanted to say, actually, another thing that I really wanted to do with this and with the Primal Point book is that, there's such beautiful writing in the literature, secondary literature of the faith. And especially I'm thinking of people like Horace Holly, George Townsend, Marcia Gale. Mm-hmm. There's such great writers. And George Ronald Publisher has been the publisher of those books, since the 1940s, is it? 50s, 40s. And I think it's a shame that we're not more familiar with some of this really great writing. So I think one of the things I was consciously trying to do with this book and Primal Point was to pull out some of these fantastic passages by Horace Holly and George Townsend and other Adi Tarzadeh, Hassan Balyuzi, so that we can get a taste of how they wrote and just how good it was. And so in a way, the book's also a bit of a tribute to George Ronald's publishers as well, and hope that it will encourage people to go back and, especially I think Horace Holly and George Townsend, but mainly Horace Holly was such a great writer.
He was,
and his insight. I mean, his knowledge and his insights were so contemporary. I mean, really, you could read those essays now, and he's on the money still.
No, Horace Holly is a really remarkable intellectual, and we can be really fortunate that the faith had such a person, such a writer at that time, because the Baha'i community was very small, did not have very many college-educated people at that time, and of course, it generally takes a fair amount of education to write well, and so we didn't have a huge number of good writers at that time, and Horace Holly was certainly one of the really remarkable ones. All the way back to 15, when he publishes his first book on the faith. It's really a quite remarkable book. Well, was there a particular quotation or story you'd like us to close with?
Yeah, there's just one passage from, I think this is a talk that Horace Holly gave in Los Angeles, and he's and I just thought this was, I put it towards the end of the book. He says, "Now a message from God must be delivered, and there was no mankind to hear his message. Therefore, God gave the world Abdu'l-Bahá. Abdu'l-Bahá received the message of Baha'u'llah on behalf of the human race. He heard the voice of God. He was inspired by the Spirit. He attained complete consciousness and awareness of the meaning of this message, and he pledged the human race to respond to the voice of God. My friends, to me, that is the covenant, that there was on this earth someone who could be a representative of an as yet uncreated race. There were only tribes, families, creeds, classes, etc. But there was no man except Abdu'l-Bahá, and Abdu'l-Bahá, as man, took to himself the message of Baha'u'llah and promised God that he would bring the people into the oneness of mankind and create a humanity that could be the vehicle for the laws of God. It is because Abdu'l-Bahá was Abdu'l-Bahá, and because he could be this hearing ear, this answering heart, this consecrated will, that an eternal covenant was made. And because of Abdu'l-Bahá, you and I are here as Baha'is. You and I are here as parts of the mankind that has to be, because man is not man until he is imbued with the qualities and life of the merciful. And there is no humanity until this one spirit of truth and the guidance of the divine will enters into the consciousness of all human beings to such an extent that each individual is not only drawn nearer to God, but he becomes one with all other men." And there's a bit that goes on a bit more. There's just one other passage which I really like. It comes from Marcia Gale, and she says to study a man's life is to live in his presence through his words and the words of those who saw him or who have thoughts about him, and especially it is to see him in the lives of those he has influenced. Now that his pen is stilled, his voice hushed, Abdu'l-Bahā's words are the Baha'is. They are his message to the world, his conversation with mankind, and they reflect, however tentatively, at this early stage of apprenticeship in Baha'i living, the life of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for your presence today in this webinar. And I want to invite everyone to come back next week, Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern Time again, when Nina Yazdani will be speaking about the writings and utterances of Abdu'l-Bahá. And then Sunday after that, on the 17th of October, again, 2 p.m., we will have Baharieh Rohani Ma'ani speaking about the changing role of women during Abdu'l-Bahā's ministry. And then skipping ahead a few weeks to mid-November, we will hear from Mona Khademi about Abdu'l-Bahá and Laurie Clifford Barney. So we have quite a few coming up. And then after that, we have even more, of course, in December and January about Abdu'l-Bahá. We have quite a lengthy collection of presentations. And this is the first one to get it started. So again, thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again.